Today, the hidden hand of digital control. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Well, latest posts covering finance and problem news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Well, I've been discussing the rise of central bank digital currencies over the past few years, and we know that in Australia the Treasury is now actively exploring the implementation of a digital Aussie Dollar for consumer use. This mirrors efforts underway in other countries, including both the UK and the US. The imposition of a digital currency may sound superficially attractive as a counter to cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, which are largely uncontrolled and decentralised. And after all, they say we are already using electronic mechanisms to transfer funds, so it is more like just a natural evolution. Plus, a central bank digital currency can be flexibly designed to meet many needs, including the ability to switch to physical cash or not, whether it's held centrally or devolved, and whether it pays interest or not. At this point, I want to remind you of our battles a couple of years back on stopping the government from banning cash transactions above a certain level on the justification of stopping fraud and money laundering. That was, of course, the thin end of the wedge, and despite recent spurious COVID-aligned justifications to reduce cash in circulation, the fact is more cash than ever is in circulation today. The other problem with central bank digital currencies is their ability to be turned off at a whim or built so they lose value over time if not spent. And a central bank digital currency could, of course, facilitate negative retail interest rates and more control over actions. Now, some have claimed this is just speculation and that central bank digital currencies are mostly harmless, to quote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But I would remind you of China's linkage between the digital yuan, such that certain social scores are required to transact, and to the point that people are now simply working within the control framework to avoid conflict, and so to be compliant to the state. So this is not just a theoretical discussion, and judging by what the Canadian government did recently, this is a real issue. The Canadian Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance Chrystia Freeland announced the government is broadening the scope of the country's anti-money laundering monitoring and terrorist financing laws to cover crowdfunding platforms and the payment service providers they use. These changes cover all forms of transactions, including digital assets such as cryptocurrencies, she announced during a recent press conference. To underscore the point, the Canadian government therefore has made it clear that it will target cryptocurrencies alongside traditional transactions. Trudeau's government emergency powers were needed to choke off money to demonstrators who've been blocking border crossings and have been parked in downtown Ottawa for more than 20 days, refusing to leave, although they've been moved on recently. The protesters were demanding an end to vaccine mandates and other COVID-19 restrictions. The new rules make demands of a broad list of entities, including banks, investment firms, credit unions, loan companies, securities dealers, fundraising platforms, insurance companies, and fraternal benefit societies. They must determine whether they're, quote, in possession or control of property of a person who's attending an illegal protest or providing supplies to demonstrators, according to the recently published orders. If they find such a person in their customer list, they must freeze their accounts and report it to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police or Canada's Intelligence Service, the regulations say. Any suspicious transactions must also be reported to the country's anti-money laundering agency, known as FinTrack. But Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's emergency orders aimed at cutting off funds to protesters have cast a wide net across the Canadian financial industry, forcing portfolio managers and securities firms to take a harder look at who they're doing business with. I think this caught everyone off guard last night when it was released. Greg Taylor, Chief Investment Officer for fund manager Purpose Investments, said on Bloomberg. There's a lot of questions right now in figuring out who we're targeting and what we have to look at. The invocation of the emergency powers, which also gives the government the power to ban public assembly in some locations, has prompted fiery debate among legislators and concerns that the government is overreaching in its bid to quell protests that have paralysed the nation's capital. Trudeau said the measures will be temporary, targeted and are reasonable and proportionate to the threat the country faces. Caldwell Securities, an investment advisory firm that operates in Ontario, hasn't received any communication from the government or law enforcement, nor a list of people whose accounts it's supposed to freeze. Caldwell said he doesn't know how exactly his firm would go about enforcing the measures, and he would seek out legal advice before making any such move. The emergency rules are posturing on the part of the government, meant to frighten protesters enough to clear the current demonstrations, he said. But if this thing is to be implemented, it will begin and end at the banking level, Caldwell said in an interview. I can't see it getting down to our level. I'd be quite surprised. The new regulations say the Act doesn't apply to insurance policies, and people who suffer injury or damage as a result of the order may apply for compensation. And the order also gives the government the power to designate certain areas as secure, protected places, including critical infrastructure. Financial institutions will be protected against lawsuits for actions they take under the emergency order, the government says. And the order also says governments have the authority to share relevant information with banks and other financial services providers if the information will help put a stop to the funding of illegal blockades and illegal activities. That applies not just to the federal government, but provinces and territories, according to a statement from the Finance Department. The new regulations apply to platforms that raise funds or virtual currency through donations, as well as payments and clearing services, whether dealing in regular currency or cryptocurrency. The censorship of money is something we see in an authoritarian country, not one like Canada, said Philippe Jett, senior consultant to the Rivermont Crypto Fund. Regardless of my views on the protests, freezing accounts for political reasons is a big, big slippery slope. The illegal blockades have highlighted the fact that crowdfunding platforms and some of the payment service providers they use are not fully captured under the Proceeds of Crime and Terrorism Financing Act. Our banks and financial institutions are already obligated to report the Financial Transaction and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada, or FINTRAC. As of today, all crowdfunding platforms and the payment service providers they use must register with FINTRAC, and they must report large and suspicious transactions to FINTRAC. And the expanded rules are in response to that ongoing Freedom Convoy protests started by Canadian truck drivers opposed to COVID-19 vaccinations and quarantine mandates for cross-border drivers that have shut down border crossings and halted downtown Ottawa. The protests, which have now entered their third week, have been partially funded by donors to self-described crowdfunding platform Give, Send, Go. The platform was hacked last week, however, resulting in thousands of donor details being stolen, including self-reported names, email addresses and zip codes. The Emergencies Act gives government powers for 30 days to ban people from gathering in certain locations, allow officials to tow private vehicles blocking roads, and give power to financial institutions to block funds used to support illegal blockades. The Emergencies Act will be used to strengthen and support law enforcement agencies at all levels across the country. This is about keeping Canadians safe, protecting people's jobs and restoring confidence in our institutions, Trudeau said. We cannot and will not allow illegal and dangerous activities to continue, assuring that the government will not use the Emergencies Act to call in the military. We're not suspending fundamental rights or overriding the Charter of Rights Freedoms. We are not limiting people's freedom of speech. We are not limiting freedom of peaceful assembly. We are not preventing people from exercising their right to protest legally, Trudeau said. But Canadian authorities have reportedly banned companies from working with 34 cryptocurrency wallets associated with the Freedom Convoy, a protest against COVID-19 restrictions, according to reports from Kane Bext of the Counter Signal. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Ontario Provincial Police are attempting to freeze transactions from 34 crypto wallets associated with the Freedom Convoy. The list purportedly includes 29 Bitcoin wallets, 2 Ethereum wallets, as well as Litecoin, Monero, and Cardano wallets. The wallets are said to contain about 25 Bitcoins worth somewhere around $1.4 million. The order says that Canadian authorities have been investigating cryptocurrency donations being collected in relation to illegal acts falling under the scope of the Emergency Measures Act. The police order does not suggest that the authorities can freeze the wallets directly. Rather, it aims to prevent FINTRAC-regulated companies from accepting funds from those wallets, thereby preventing the holders from cashing out their crypto via exchanges. And the Emergencies Act covers all forms of transactions, including digital assets such as cryptocurrencies. The utility of cryptocurrencies for the nations has increasingly been utilised by civilian protests. Notably, for example, Ukrainian volunteer groups and non-government organisations saw a 900% increase in funding via Bitcoin last year from the previous year, possibly in the face of the increasing Russian military presence at its borders. But consider this: how much easier it would be to control the access to money if it were sitting in a central bank digital currency account. Potentially total transparency and total control. The Canadian experience underscores for me the importance of safeguarding our financial system, and we should be aware of the grave risk that exists from those in government and the security services that want more direct control. My view is we need to be very cautious about a CBDC, and the safeguards need to be carefully spelled out, because the risk of the removal of civil liberties later on security grounds is all too tempting. I'm reminded of the parable of the frog in the pan. A frog sitting in a pan of water, which is slowly heated, does not react until it's too late and is cooked, literally. I feel the same way about the digitalisation of money and of central bank digital currencies in particular. And so the Canadian story is, for me, a wake-up call. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.